quiet as thunderbolts. And I kept it from you like a kill. My name, my legacy, my shoulder chip, and the small hollow beneath where I can be wounded. The long house I whittled to matchsticks, abalone filling up with hair ties, coin bank buffaloes and iron turtles, a pen flash of identity, an almond eye watching from between the white bookcases and photographs of cities, orchards, graves.
The poems in Kenzie Allen's first collection, Cloud Missives, are faceted crystals, refracting light on subjects as wide-ranging as Native American identity, health and healing, and kinship and love. Allen mines her education in archeology and anthropology to dissect the matters of the heart that we wear on our physical bodies, with poetry as a means of connection.
And I think poetry in general allows you to develop your own vocabulary for things. It rewards experimentation, and it allows you to kind of create that voice of your own on the page.
In this interview, Allen talks about her debut collection of poems and her multimodal poetry projects, which establish her as a significant new voice in literature. Kenzie Allen, it's great to have you here today to talk about your book of poetry, Cloud Missives.
It's wonderful to be here. Thank you, Yowanko.
What's Yowanko? Tell me what that means.
Yowanko is thank you in Oneida.
In Oneida.
And I can say Seguliswagwake. Hello to all of you, my friends.
Great. Thank you. Your book is a full collection of poetry. How long did it take you to write that?
Oh, it took me about 10 years. Or some of the poems are actually from 2012, some of them are from 2011, and some of the poems were written just last year. I figured out what the gaps were in the narrative and then wrote into those gaps at the end of it. But even the poems that were written about 10 years ago, some of them got new lines in the process of editing the book. So it's sort of, I think of it as a bit of a palimpsest where you have things kind of layering on top of each other. And it took that long to write it, and it also took a little bit of time to find a publisher and to work with the team at Tin House.
Tin House, yeah, that's a great company, great publishing company and literary organization.
Yeah, they work really hard, and just really wonderful process of editing and prepping the book.
There's a lot of poems in here. A lot of times poets do what's called a chapbook. They'll release something shorter. But your book almost has like 4 chapbooks in it because it has these sections that I thought were really fascinating. The first one is called, and all of these words very poetically have a lot of meaning to them. Pathology was the first one, and then manifest. Letters I don't send, which was wonderful. We all need to have letters we don't send. And then love songs, which is really broad. And so how did you decide, you mentioned sort of needing to fill in maybe some connective tissue. How did you decide to divide the book up that way?
Well, originally I had actually divided it just into, I realized this the other day, I finally looked back at it, and I had divided it into just numbered sections. And at some point I realized that that doesn't offer as much of the conceptual to the sections. Like when you have a title for each of the sections, now you can read the poems both on their own terms and then in light of that title. And there were actually some sort of attempts at chapbooks in there. There was the pathology section had a chapbook that was associated with it. The letters had a chapbook, and even the manifest section had kind of another version of that was shorter. But I just didn't realize that it needed to be those sections until quite late in the process. And part of that is I tape all the poems up on the wall, and I call it my poetry murder board. Because in the movies, when you see the pictures on the wall with the string and the Post-it notes and everything, that's called a murder board, supposedly. And so this was my poetry murder board. And you can move things around on the wall. You can see how the poems speak to each other and see where those gaps are and how to write into those gaps. So I think a lot of books nowadays, like you have the project type books that are all one sustained project, and then you have these kind of more compilation style books. And I've done project books that I've been working on, but it was really interesting to get to do a compilation book for these and really let poems that I didn't expect to speak to each other kind of reach across those sections as much as within them.
And, pathology, you think of that word, and it's could be samples of body tissue, many, many, many meanings to it. And then you have things in there that will stay with me, like the indentation on a ring finger where the ring no longer is, very specific things about the body, the physical body here and there. Did you know that was going to be something that was going to be thematically through that section?
That section was the most cohesive in terms of being about the body. I think what I didn't expect to come into it as much were poems that were more about the archeology and the anthropology part of it. But it really was like I called it the Body Project for a while. And it was originally inspired by archaeology, too, and this forensic anthropology class that I had taken. So just ways that the body responds to our habits and the sort of things that are encoded in the body, literally encoded in our bones, and the things that don't show up in the body, like things like mental health, things like trauma, and experiences that you've had. So things that'll show up in the body are those indentations on the fingers, or the way that if you're crouched a lot, like I talk about a man bent in the mines, then that will show up in your foot bones and your calves. And then even whether you're right-handed or left-handed can be told from the body based on the thickness of the bones. So that was really sort of just fun to use that knowledge that I had picked up into the book. But I didn't realize how that would interact with a personal relationship until later when I was writing that section. And I guess that's kind of another meaning of pathology, is the sort of the pathological element or pathos.
You talk about your background in anthropology. Can you elaborate on that a little bit for us?
I think of anthropology as my first love a little bit. I majored in anthropology at Washington University in St. Louis, and I did my archaeological field school to start that out at Cahokia Mounds here in St. Louis. And I think I've always been really interested in the human condition and human stories. To me, anthropology and archaeology are another type of storytelling. So you take, for example, human remains, and you try to tell the story of the life that led to that particular layout. Or you take the story of culture and the ways that it affects our cognition, our language, where we live, the different elements of that landscape that we utilize in culture, and you apply it to even the individual human stories that you learn. I think also coming from an Indigenous background, it's an interesting intersection there. Anthropology is a very colonial science historically. And so there is this kind of new movement in terms of what they're calling native anthropology, which is Indigenous populations using those tools or speaking back against those tools and telling their own stories. So there were all these kind of intersections there. But I'm just kind of love to nerd out a little bit. And anthropology is, I also call it the science that you don't have to pick a major if you pick anthropology. You can do almost anything and put it under that heading of anthropology. Yeah.
And I think poetry.
Yeah.
You see in yours.
Yeah, I'm really interested nowadays in poetry as an anthropological method. So if you are working with a certain population, it's not just that you yourself as the anthropologist can write poetry as a means of understanding, as a means of sort of responding to emotionally the work that you're doing. And I think it's important to respond emotionally to it, to not think of it as this detached, objective thing, because nothing's objective. There's always bias. But you can also ask that population to write their own poetry and write their own story. And I think poetry in general allows you to develop your own vocabulary for things. It rewards experimentation, and it allows you to kind of create that voice of your own on the page or multiple voices over the course of several pages. Yeah.
When you were talking about the role of the body in this first section, especially of your book, I was thinking about you're a multimodal artist. Tell us a little bit about that. You had a project where you actually had some words, your body was sort of a physical space that had poetry.
Yeah, and that was actually one of the poems in the book. Ask Me How It Happened is a poem that talks about different scars on the body and maps the scars on the body. And I was at this literary festival in Lisbon one year, and they did this really wonderful workshop that was very multimodal. And one of the things that we did was physically map something. And I said, oh, that poem is perfect. And so I tried to map on different parts of the body that corresponded with the poem, the different lines. But when I wrote that poem, those lines were already corresponding to parts on my body. So if there was a scar on my knee, I was writing around the scar at that point in the poem. And I think that's something I'm really interested in is multimodality, but also transmedia work, where you take a particular piece and you translate it into multiple different mediums, even the same sort of project. So that's kind of what I'm working on now, but it's a little harder to get that stuff published. So a lot of that's on my website.
Because you're Native American, do you think that that makes you sort of very curious to explore this sort of connection with the body and anthropology and the history and then poetry that arises out of that?
I think so. And I think that's also part of the multimodality aspect of it, because Indigenous stories have always been multimodal. We've always been telling our stories through oral histories, through beading, through dance, and even through earthworks, like the Cahokia mounds or the mound building cultures around here. And so I feel like our stories have always been those multiple modes. Our stories have always been very rooted in the body. If you think of oral histories, the body is your instrument for the oral histories, and the breath lives in the body. And I think that's true of poetry, too. Poetry asks us to have the breath be part of the poem. A very good practice is to read the poems aloud as you're drafting them, and then afterward we always have these poetry readings. And I think also that Indigenous connection really is what brings land into the equation, and land is kind of this secret other character in the book, I think, but it's also a kind of very real life. It's got its own sort of personality. It's got its own humanity in a way that we think of the land as our mother, or we think of the non-human cousins that we have in the world, the more than human world as well.
I know from your bio that you lived part of the time in Wisconsin on the Oneida Reservation. Can you tell us a little bit about your Native American heritage?
Yeah, that's on my mother's side. And so my mother is an enrolled tribe member in the Oneida Nation of Wisconsin. And we did not grow up, like I did not grow up on the reservation. I grew up part of the time here in St. Louis. And my grandmother, her house was where I was living, and she had pictures of Haudenosaunee, or sometimes known as Iroquois chiefs, on the walls, and all of this artwork. And I grew up understanding I was Oneida. And, you know, if your grandmother is Oneida, she tells you you're Oneida, you're Oneida. And so I had all that when I was in my house. And then when I would leave my house, all I had were these sort of stereotypical figures like Disney's Pocahontas or Disney's Tiger Lily. Why is it always Disney? And Indiana Jones, and these kinds of pop culture figures that told a certain story of indigeneity when that did not line up with my experience of it. My mother did move back to our reservation later on in my life, and so that's where I go back to. I think of it as a home. I don't get to spend as much time there as I'd like to, but it is important to understand the community there, to interact with the community there, to have them know who you are. They know your people. They know your ancestors. And so our family, the reason we were away from the reservation for such a long time is because my great-grandfather went to the Carlisle Industrial Boarding School. Actually, 2 generations of our family went to the boarding school, and then he went overseas in World War I and something about Native American people is that they serve in the military at the highest rate of any demographic. So serving in the military is very much a sort of honorable thing to do, but it's also that you're protecting the land when you do that. So he went overseas. He met his wife overseas, an English woman, and he wrote her letters to move back to the reservation with him, and then they couldn't find work. So they went down to Oklahoma, and then my grandmother went to Venezuela when she met my grandfather. So in 2 generations, we were very much removed from the reservation. And we had been kind of trying to find our way back since then. So that's the way that we have come back to the reservation. That's why I try to spend as much time there as I can. I try to learn my language. It's a slow process, but I try to speak as much as I can at any one time. And I'm also listed as a descendant, and my daughter is also listed as a descendant.
You mentioned Indiana Jones and Pocahontas, and they're dealt with in some of your poems. Can you tell me why you decided to examine those cultural figures?
Those seem to be kind of an entry point a little bit for a lot of people. For several generations, that's what it was when you had these stories in Hollywood, for example. You have the Hollywood Indian is like a character. And so when I would leave my house, that's what I interacted with. And at first, I felt like I had to speak to those figures in order to then pivot and speak to lived experience, because we needed that shared reference point. And I found that when I was speaking directly to lived experience, I had some trouble with people saying, I just don't understand it. It doesn't translate to me. I don't have like a starting point for it. So for a long time, I felt like I had to write to those figures in order to write away from them. And then later on, I feel like that conversation actually has evolved in the last 10 years. So later in my process for the book, I felt like I was able to write poems that just went directly to lived experience. So there is a poem in here called Elegy Against Elegy that draws upon the Haudenosaunee Thanksgiving address to address all the different plants and animals and parts of the earth that nourish us and that are family members, essentially. And so that is also in the book. But it's part of that process also to kind of understand your place in the world, especially when you have all of those assimilatory pressures on you. So I think that's reflected in that section of like coming to terms with what you're pushing back against and then leaning into what guides you.
Elegy Against Elegy was beautiful. That is a beautiful poem. Those who have left me so much. I mean, what a gorgeous line. I have a lot of lines listed here that are like truths that I just wrote down from your poetry. And the one about the date with the British Empire made me laugh. I mean, that is terrific.
I had a poem title for that for such a long time. It was originally a conversation with the British Empire. And then I was like, wait, why is the British Empire not this dude bro that you would go on a really terrible date with? And he has 6 popped collars and he's dressed in things that have tiny muskets on them or birds that no longer exist. I had so much fun writing that poem, and it was just hard to cut it down to a manageable length because there was so much to say.
You could go on and on with it, and I love how it ends, the irony. The sun has set and it is night.
The sun finally sets on the British Empire.
Finally sets on the British Empire, right. Right. When you were talking about place, you have a couple of other places you divide your time. One is, I think you teach in Ontario. So is that your primary residence? Are you in Canada primarily?
Right now, yeah. I'm in Toronto and I teach at York University, which is a really great situation because it's a population where the students are so kind to each other and they're so warm and they form these beautiful communities. But it's also like a new place for me to be. So I like traveling a lot and I really like connecting to landscapes in different places. And the skies, speaking of clouds, the skies in Toronto are magnificent. Yeah.
Then speaking of beautiful places, Norway. What takes you to Norway?
Well, my husband is Norwegian, and when I went to Lisbon for this international literary festival, I met this Norwegian who was there because it was warm. And And the rest is kind of history, the same way that my great-grandfather wrote letters to my great-grandmother and had her come live on the reservation. We did the long-distance thing for a while, and then I finally moved to Norway. And I lived there off and on for about 4 to 5 years, and it was the absolute most beautiful place. And just going outside your house, you could go on these walks that had just gorgeous landscape, and a lot of poems blossomed from that because I think the land informs a lot of my poetry.
Tell us about the love songs a little bit, that part of your book.
I think of the love songs as a way, after you've been through all of the kind of there's different kinds of violence in the book. There's domestic violence, there's colonial violence, there's taking back your power in the letters I don't send. And then I think of the love songs as kind of coming home to yourself, but through your connection to the world around you. So I think that in a way, you can't fully heal until you come back to what is your community, but also your community of all the different influences in your life. And I have found myself writing these love songs and these odes to different things to kind of honor them in my life. I think it really started with this one of the poems that I wrote to the desert tortoise, which was a circumstance where it was a project where we were all writing to endangered animals. And I was so delighted that I got the tortoise because we are Turtle Clan in my family. And so that spun out from there. I realized, I want to write something to the man announcing powwows and rodeos, who is the same person. It's always that same guy. And he says, our young ones are future. And then I realized I wanted to write to the different planes that I would take when I would go back to the reservation, which are these little tiny, they call them puddle jumpers. So it was sort of each thing spun out from the previous thing before it. And it really was just a way of celebrating the world around me, because there was a lot of poetry in the book that was working out that healing process and working out those responses to pain and difficulty in the life. And so I wanted to end on notes of joy.
Your book feels very circular in that way. It really does. If I had to think of a shape for it, I noticed that. It kind of starts, almost in a microphotography, very close with the body and broadens out and then comes back.
I like that a lot. And it makes me think about also notions of Indigenous time and the way that our generations kind of cycle back every time. We think of speaking to the seventh generations in terms of 7 generations back and 7 generations ahead of us. And time is very cyclical. Narratives are often very cyclical in Indigenous literatures. So it means a lot to me that you're finding the circles and the elliptical sort of nature of the book.
Yeah. And your ode, you have an ode to lookouts and lighthouse keepers. They wait for disaster to ease the waiting. People who are on watch for us. That's something that'll stay with me.
I love that you love that poem because it's one of my favorite poems in the book, because it comes out of experiences that I have volunteering for a fire lookout, volunteering for the Forest Service on a fire lookout in the Oregon Cascades with my dad. And we have done that almost all my life. And it is a tedious process. You do kind of wait for something to happen, some kind of action. And this last time there was no action. It was just hot and but you have to keep on watch the whole time. And I do learn a lot about the self, and you learn a lot about being alone and making peace with the things in your life you need to make peace with.
There's so much strong imagery in your collection. Do you start with an image, or do you start with words or an idea, or where do you start?
It's all of those things. Some of the time it'll be a concept. So I save a lot of articles online and things like that. So one of the poems in here is a crab love poem, I call it, it's a love poem, but it's through the lens of what's called carcinization, which is how everything is evolving to try to become a crab. So lobsters are crab-shaped, but they're not crabs. Hermit crabs are actually not crabs, but they are crab-shaped. So everything's evolving to be a crab. And for some reason that reminded me of love in a way. And so that was where it was a concept at first. Some of the time it's a title. So Ghost of the British Empire was a title that I felt like I had to write into. Some of the time it's a particular like a particular line or a particular music of that line. And I'll have the music and I'll kind of write a few lines to get the feel of the poem, and then I'll be able to come back to it and finish the draft. And then some of the time it's just a kind of word that comes and then spinning out from there. I find that these drafts kind of spin out from one particular place. I'm really interested in human connection, and I think that that's something that I hope that people reading this book will come away with, is the way that love is a very powerful force of connection. Shared stories are a powerful force of connection. And I think as far as how we move forward with Indigenous nations and with Indigenous rights and sovereignty, part of that is how we tell the story. Having the story come from Indigenous voices is very important, because how do you imagine a future if you can't learn from each other's stories? And if the stories have been these stereotypes for so long, and now we suddenly have all of these beautiful Indigenous voices to hear from, how can that change the way that our hearts are committed to Indigenous rights and Indigenous sovereignty and to learning from Indigenous ways of knowing? So I think it's not just the story that you tell, it's how you tell that story and how you connect with that audience. And so I really hope that this is part of that beautiful proliferation of Indigenous stories that's out there. And I hope people will continue to read those stories.
How do you know when you're done with a poem?
Oh, I don't know if I'm ever done with the poem. I think like what's fun about that is you can continue to read the poems differently. You can have, if you make it to that level, you can have a new and selected where you also edit the poems. But you do have to stop at some point and you have to say, okay, I think this has leaned into the places that it needed to. It hasn't come to a close, because you don't want the poem to end on a kind of conclusion. You want to leave that for the reader. So you don't want to wrap it up neatly in a bow, but you want to leave something for the reader to continue to ponder. And as long as you've led into that a little bit, you got the music right leading up to the ending, then I think that that's where I'm realizing that it's kind of ended. And then also you just have a deadline. At some point I had to stop editing it. And it was very hard to stop editing it, but at some point we had to send it to the printers.
What are you working on now? Are you going to have another book come out?
Well, I have several projects that I've been working on. Some of them, like I mentioned, multimodality is a little bit hard to publish sometimes. So there are some projects that are very multimodal that I'm not sure what's going to happen with them. But I just started work on a follow-up to Cloud Missives. I'm calling it Diary of Belief. I'm not sure if that's the final title, but I like it's starting to grow on me. And it is actually structured very much the same way as Cloud Missives. It's got these different sections. It ends with love songs, because I cannot stop writing love songs. And it's also that I might have that sequential poem that's in there. But I'm really enjoying that idea of like a compilation, because then you can embrace that interdisciplinarity. You can embrace all these different influences in the life and put it all together. So I'm hoping that I put those poems on the wall soon and start moving them around.
Good. Great. Kenzie Allen, thank you so much for being here to talk about your book, Cloud Missives. It was a wonderful, beautiful collection of poems.
Thank you so much. Yowanko, thank you. Nagiwa.